Zaporizhzhia, October 10, 2025. 3 a.m. What you just saw is part of the largest coordinated Russian attack since the beginning of the war. 465 drones and 32 missiles were used on targets spread throughout Ukraine. Putin wanted to send a message. He succeeded. But Ukraine prepared a response, which came from a place he thought was impossible. It originated 1,400 kilometers inside Russia. And it left 500,000 Russians in the dark. And look, that was just the beginning. First, let me show you what really happened that night. Because this wasn't a regular military operation. It was the third consecutive year that Russia attacked Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Before winter arrives, there's even a name for this: Weaponizing winter. In other words, it means turning winter into a weapon. The strategy is simple and brutal. Their idea goes something like this: if you can't win on the battlefield, try to break the civilian population. Cut off the power, cut off the water, cut off the heating when the cold comes, and force the government to surrender to end the people's suffering. That being said, you'll now understand why that night in Zaporizhzhia was part of something much bigger. In Kyiv, 800,000 people were left without electricity. 2 million were left without water.
Homes and lives. It's all part of a well-tested Russian tactic, depriving Ukrainians of heat and light just before the winter months. This time, it's also an act of revenge.
In Kharkiv, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, it's the same story. Widespread blackouts. And it was no accident. Russia used some of its most advanced missile systems. The Kinzhal was one of them. A missile they call hypersonic. And there's also the Iskander, an extremely precise tactical ballistic missile. These are expensive, sophisticated weapons made to penetrate advanced air defenses. But here's the important detail. Russia's strategy is called victory by volume. The idea isn't that every missile or drone hits the target. It's to launch so many that some inevitably get through, no matter how good the defense is. And that night, even with the Ukrainian forces shooting down 405 out of 465 drones and 15 out of 32 missiles, the ones that got through caused massive destruction. Now, if we consider international law, there's no doubt that this is a war crime. Deliberately attacking essential civilian infrastructure necessary for the survival of the population violates the Geneva Conventions. We're not just talking about laws that exist on paper. The International Criminal Court has already indicted the former Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and the chief of staff, Valery Gerasimov, for previous attacks, exactly like this one. But while Ukrainian cities were plunged into darkness, something interesting was happening. On Russian state television, a commentator sat in front of the cameras and said something surprising. He said the attacks were humanitarian. That's right, humanitarian. The logic presented was this: by destroying Ukrainian infrastructure and plunging the country into cold and darkness, Russia was actually trying to save Ukrainian lives. And they wanted to achieve this goal by forcing the Zelensky government to realize the reality and negotiate peace more quickly. Think about that for a second. Attacks that leave millions without electricity and water at the beginning of winter are being described as humanitarian aid. It sounds like a joke, doesn't it? But that's good old Russian propaganda. The goal is to create a parallel reality where Russia is not seen as an aggressor, but as a savior. And, as absurd as it may seem to us, this narrative works inside Russia. It reassures the Russian population that their government is doing the right thing, even when the actions completely contradict that statement. But what really matters? This is where the story gets interesting. Less than 24 hours after that attack, sirens started to sound in Belgorod, a Russian region that borders Ukraine. And it wasn't the first time, it was the third in just 2 weeks. But this time was different. Ukraine didn't just attack random substations. It attacked the main Luch thermal power plant, a rural region in Russia. The result? 500,000 people without electricity. The governor of the region tried to downplay the problem. He said in an official statement that the blackouts were caused by falling debris, not by direct drone attacks. He said there could be rolling blackouts in the coming days as a precaution. But videos on social media told a different story. They showed massive fires, explosions at critical substations. The attempt to control the narrative didn't work when people could see what was happening with their own eyes. And Ukraine didn't stop there. While Belgorod was dealing with the darkness, Ukrainian drones visited a factory in the occupied territory of Donetsk, a factory that produced first-person view drones, those small first-person drones that have become one of the deadliest weapons of this war. The factory produced ammunition. Later images showed the site completely destroyed. This wasn't just retaliation, it was a strategic attack, directly targeting Russia's military production capability. But the attack that really changed everything happened in a place you've probably never heard of. Ufa. The capital of the Republic of Bashkortostan is about 400 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. And until that week, it was completely out of reach of anything Ukraine could do. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. A Ukrainian drone flew all that distance and hit the Bashneft refinery. But this is not just any refinery. It's among Russia's 3 largest, with a production capacity of 24 million tons per year. It supplies gasoline, diesel, and other products directly to the Russian armed forces. The attack caused a fire near the crude oil distillation unit and forced a partial shutdown of operations. Anyone who thinks this was luck is mistaken. It was the 3rd attack by Ukrainian intelligence in that region, just in October. 3 attacks in 1 month, 1,400 kilometers away. That proves skill, not luck. Now take a moment to think about what we're seeing here. Homemade drones flying over 1,000 kilometers inside Russian territory and hitting strategic targets. How is this possible? There are 2 parts to the answer. First of all, there's Ukrainian technology. Since the beginning of the war, Ukraine has developed a new generation of long-range drones. These are systems like Lyuti and Firepoint, which separate the movements. And Ruti. They are all domestically produced, and Ukraine has demonstrated the ability to use them on a large scale. There have been reports of coordinated attacks using up to 300 drones simultaneously. But there's a second part to this equation, which is equally important: American intelligence. Since July of this year, the United States has started providing detailed data to support Ukraine's long-range attack campaign against the Russian energy sector. And that intelligence is crucial, because it's not enough to have a drone that flies 1,400 kilometers. You need to know which route to take to avoid the S-400 air defense system. You need to know exactly where the refinery is most vulnerable. You need to know when the radar shifts change, where the blind spots are. That's what turns a relatively cheap drone into a precision weapon. Think of it this way. A Ukrainian drone costs somewhere between $50,000 to $100,000 to produce. A Russian Kinzhal missile costs about $10 million. The math is on Ukraine's side. And when you add quality intelligence to that equation, the effectiveness increases exponentially. Now, let's talk about the real impact of these attacks, because there's a lot of confusion and numbers being thrown around out there. You may have already heard some numbers behind the destruction of Russian refining capacity. Some go as high as 38%. But the truth is that number needs context. It represents the total combined capacity of all 16 refineries that were attacked in August and September. That number assumes that each of those refineries was completely destroyed. But in practice, things are more complicated. Many of those refineries are still operating, just at reduced capacity. Russian repair teams are able to bring some units back relatively quickly. But even so, the impact is real and measurable. Russian gasoline production fell by 10%. The Russian newspaper Kommersant confirmed this. Russia's total refining production fell below 5 million barrels per day, the lowest level since the spring of 2022. And this translates directly into money. In September, Russia's revenues from petroleum product exports fell by 13% compared to the previous month. The export volume fell by 9%. This forces Russia to export more crude oil, which is less profitable than refined products like diesel and gasoline. It means lower profit margins. It means less tax revenue for the state. But the most visible impact is happening inside Russia. President Zelensky himself stated that the attacks caused a fuel shortage equivalent to up to 20% of Russian demand. And this is not just statistics. These are lines at gas stations. These are prices going up. These are ordinary Russian people feeling the consequences of a war that once seemed distant. The Russian government was forced to take drastic action.
Russia decided to ban fuel exports until the end of the year amid Ukraine's attacks on the Russian power grid.
Banning gasoline exports. That's not a sign of strength. It's a sign of desperation. And there's more. The International Energy Agency projects that Russian refineries won't fully recover from this damage until at least mid-2026. The reason? Western sanctions block Russia's access to specialized components and technology needed for complex refinery repairs. Russia needs to seek less advanced alternatives from countries like China. Slower repairs, degraded technology, higher costs. Now, think about the strategic dilemma this creates for Putin. To defend refineries and other critical facilities spread across Russian territory, he needs to relocate air defense systems like the S-400, which are extremely valuable. But if you take these systems from the front line or from Moscow to protect, say, Ufa, you create vulnerabilities in other places. And now Ukraine gets to choose where to attack. The initiative has shifted. Russia is no longer just attacking, it's having to defend its own territory. And when you hear about asymmetric warfare, this is a perfect example of it in action. With a relatively small investment in developing and producing long-range drones, Ukraine is causing billions of dollars in damage, lost revenue, and logistical chaos in Russia's main economic engine. The cost-effectiveness of these attacks for Ukraine is exceptional. As for Russia, well, the cost of defending hundreds of vulnerable static facilities spread across a vast territory is astronomical. Now, do you remember what that Russian commentator said about the attack being a kind of humanitarian aid? Russian propaganda didn't stop there. It can get even worse. Days after these attacks, another propagandist appeared on Russian state television. And he had an interesting proposal. He said that European countries, specifically Belgium and France, should pay reparations to Russia for the damages caused by Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian refineries. The logic presented was this: any fund of frozen Russian assets that is used to help Ukraine will simply be added to a future reparations account that Russia will present. And guess who will pay?
Belgium, France, and the Netherlands will pay.
Belgium, France, other European countries. Think about what that means. In international law, the principle of reparations is clear. The aggressor pays for the damages caused to the victim. Germany paid reparations after World War II. Iraq paid reparations to Kuwait. It is the aggressor who compensates the victim. But here, Russian propaganda turns this completely upside down, turns the aggressor into the victim, and demands that the victim's allies pay for having helped in the defense. As absurd as it may seem, this serves a strategic purpose within Russia. It prepares the domestic population for a longer and more expensive conflict and counters potential criticism about the rising costs of the war. And it creates a narrative where Russia is not the cause of the chaos, but the victim of a larger Western conspiracy. For 3 years, this war had a clear geography. It was happening in Ukraine. Russians watched it on television. Their cities functioned normally. Their refineries produced fuel. Their power plants supplied energy. There was a comfortable separation between the war over there and life here. Putin always counted on that. He always knew that as long as ordinary Russians didn't feel direct consequences, he could continue the war indefinitely. But now, for the first time since 2022, ordinary Russians are feeling the impact. Not on television, but at the gas pump, in the lines at the stations, in our rolling blackouts, in the news about refineries catching fire hundreds of kilometers from the border. In places that should be safe, war is no longer something that only happens to others. It's happening to them. Putin wanted to use winter as a weapon against Ukraine. Now it's Russians who are in the dark. And that message he wanted to send, Ukraine responded loud and clear from 1,400 kilometers away. Now I want to know your opinion. How long do you think the Russian economy can withstand this pace of attacks on refineries before it collapses? Leave your answer in the comments. If this content helped you better understand what's happening in this war, share it with someone who also needs to see this. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next analyses. See you next time.